When I was very young, I became interested in the visual form of the Chinese language. I was really drawn to characters. It seemed like this, to kind of go to our somewhat biased language, it seemed like this sort of romantic and inscrutable mystery, this beautiful form. So, after like 5 or 6, my parents asked the owner of the local Chinese restaurant that we often ate at to give me some characters to copy. So, I got a paintbrush and I copied characters. And as young children are wont to do, I kind of lost interest after about 5 or 6 years, or sorry, 5 or 6 months, I should say. um, I studied Latin in high school, and so I had no required language courses when I got to college. But I was really fascinated by China, and I thought, well, if I don't learn now, then I'm never going to learn. And I am a very visual learner. I have a very good ear. I'm not good at grammar. I learned Latin. I wasn't good at Latin. I think if I had to try to learn French or Italian, it might be more of a challenge. But Chinese is much more about learning patterns, intonations, and then kind of like a strict um, a strict routine of visual, graphical repetition to learn the characters. And so that really
Right.
appealed to like my styles of learning. I studied for a semester my freshman year. I stopped because it was like just taking up a lot of my time. I didn't have summer plans. And I saw an advertisement saying, we need teachers in China. We'll pay for your plane ticket. We'll pay for your housing. And I was like, well, I'm not doing anything. I might as well go. I got there, and the little bit of Chinese that I spoke was enough to open up this world of connection and relationships. I mean, I'd learned Latin, but I wasn't going to talk to the Pope. Virgil's been gone for a while. Horace, Catullus, Cicero, they're not going to come and have a beer with me, but some young guy on the street in China will. And so having that interaction, having that feedback really motivated me. And so I got back, and then I just threw myself into studying. And I studied political science, but I was really focused on learning Chinese. I went back every summer throughout my university career. And then um, I was originally planning, my hope was to be a photojournalist. And so I spent 6 months in Xinjiang in Western China after I graduated. My girlfriend, later my wife, was a year below me. And she said, well, you should come back. I don't want you to be traveling into like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. This is 2004. This is right when the U.S. was involved militarily in the region. I was interested in like war photography. She's like, you should come back. That's not safe. I was like, okay, that's fine. I spent some time working between the United States and Guangzhou in southern China. And then there was a summer where I was planning on becoming an attorney, a lawyer. I was like, well, I need a summer job. I went on Craigslist, which in America is kind of like everything grab bag want ads kind of website. And I saw a job offering that offered health insurance as an assistant for a Chinese contemporary artist. And I saw the email address, and then I was like, wait, there's books about this guy. Like I went to the Columbia Library. I was like, well, this guy's pretty interesting. I went to the job interview, and he had me read a text in Mandarin, like read the text, and felt pretty good about it. I called them up and I said, well, I've got all these job offers. If you don't hire me, I'm going to go somewhere else. I didn't, but it worked. I got the job, and I spent the next decade doing like really a wide range of project management, art sales, interpreting, translating, installing major exhibitions at the British Museum, at the Metropolitan Museum. I moved two 20-ton phoenixes made out of construction site debris from Beijing to Mass Mocha down to New York, installed them in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, doing a lot of really varied, engaging, deep problem solving type stuff across cultures. So that was really, again, like that was another 10 years of just speaking Chinese every day, reading and writing. He owned a building, had won the MacArthur Genius Award, had a building in Brooklyn. He was based in New York, but he didn't speak English or read or write English. So all of his communication to the English speaking world went through me. And so, yeah, that was like the master class
Incredible.
in Chinese for me.
Incredible. Have you done anything specifically with the political science since you were at Columbia in New York,
Yeah,
weren't
that's
you?
right.
Have you done anything with the political science, or perhaps the better question is, has that political science grounding helped you in terms of working with what I guess is a very different culture?
I had a history professor who said that he was traveling in China once. He was a professor of Islamic society. He's a brilliant man, and he said I was watching these peasants shoveling mounds of night soil, human feces, and he said the job of an historian is to look through the piles of shit and to say, this is what's happened. And he said, the job of a political scientist is to look through the piles of shit and to pretend like there's some reason behind it. And so I think that insofar as the ability to obtain some reason into why things happen, I'm not sure if my political science training has done me any favors, but I think that whether it's art or education, understanding systems, sort of bridging gaps between different cultural understandings of value, of what is important, what is central to the functioning of a larger polity or the small
Yeah.
ecosystems of a school or a museum. So I think I think any kind of analytical approach of trying to understand different perspectives. I think, again, I don't know about applying rules to our reality, but I think that we can think about how our values inform the systems that we design and the outcomes that we're trying to obtain through the design of those systems.
And I'm fascinated. Does political science in the States, does that tend to suck in chunks of philosophy as well?
It can, it's there's political philosophy, so there is that sort of that stream or that strand. At Columbia, you had international politics, which was like much more international relations, American politics, which is much more about the institutions of American government, and then comparative politics, which is about sort of like looking at a variety of systems and then
Right.
understanding relationships between those. I would say that, political philosophy is one stream. I think a lot of the political science that I was engaged in studying was much more about like statistics and analyzing trends and less sort of prescriptive in the sense of this is what we should do and more about this is what's happened and this is what
Right.
informs what is.
I want to go back, if you don't mind, Jesse, to this summer when we met.
Hmm.
And I have to tell you, and I'll contextualize this for the listeners in a moment, but the 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 interaction, that the dance between you and Ms Cheng on that stage was, it was just glorious. That the relationship that you two have, and the understanding and the timing and the articulation of her message, it was just a joy to behold. So thanks for that. And for those listening, Jesse works with an incredible Chinese lady, Ms Cheng Xuequin. I
No,
hope I've
beautiful.
pronounced that correctly. Is that reasonably good?
Beautiful. That was a beautiful pronunciation.
Perhaps that's me harping back to a little bit of. I'd never studied Chinese, but I did study Wing Chun for quite a long time.
Yeah.
So she founded something called Anji Play, which we're going to go on to talk about in some detail, hopefully. But so she delivered a beautiful 25 minute talk, completely in Mandarin. I think it's fair to say, having met her before her talk, she does not speak a word of
Yeah.
English, not even hello. But a very warm lady. She was on stage. You were with her, and she talked us through this incredible education philosophy that we're going to talk about. But if you don't mind, I want to read you something that I wrote a couple of days
Yeah,
later
please.
and posted. Typed, I have to say, but
Mm.
and posted on a little thing I was working on at the time. So to Ms Cheng Xuequin and the Saturday 9:30 slot at this year's Do Lectures, what a joy that session was. Ms Cheng doesn't speak a word of English, but accompanied by her brilliant translator Jessie, she told us the story of Anji Play, her transformative play-first approach to kindergarten education in Anji County, China. 14,000 kids in 130 new kindergartens have benefited from her philosophy, rooted in love, freedom, risk, and reflection. I couldn't help thinking how similar to my childhood her methods were, albeit mine was 52 years ago. So, how is it that it takes the story of one woman from an altogether different culture to jolt MIT, the Lego Foundation, and the World Economic Forum into recognizing what we all already know, which is that kids learn and mature through play? This is not for 1 minute to diminish the brilliance of what Ms Cheng is doing or has already achieved, but it has to make us ask, what is it going to really take for us to wake up in the West and see that our education philosophy is not fit for purpose? Plenty in the West know this. Peter Gray's work, for example, is utterly brilliant. And by the way, inculcating play as a superpower in kids, he's shown us that this leads to improved, insightful problem solving in adults, amongst other things, which in turn means more innovation. Is it any wonder China is crushing us with this stuff? Now, I don't know whether you agree with that, but I was so moved by the talk.
Yeah.
I just felt I had to get some of my thoughts down. Have you got any reflections
Yeah,
on that?
what I would say is that it doesn't do, in fact, I think it's almost the opposite of diminishing what she does. The fact that she was able to access something that is so almost universally deeply understood as the needs of human beings, of human children, to engage with the world around them, create systems where that is the focus of educational practice, and then bring it directly to those with power who have created a lot of confusion and obfuscation around what education is. And I'm not saying they're doing it with bad intentions, but when you get people whose degrees and funding and large organizations become about measurement or about complexity, about imposing a top down view of what is valuable in terms of learning and then what their role is in making that possible, it's disempowering. It's about knowledge, it's about expertise coming from outside of the individual child or outside of the relationship between the child and the adults that care about them. So I think it takes an incredibly powerful, clear eyed person to identify something so basic and simple and say, this is what is necessary. And I'm going to obtain the resources to make this possible. So I think there's this part of her story where even before she began this play revolution in Anji County, she was the administrator at the county level in charge of early education. When she started, there were 4 kindergartens, and in China, kindergarten is ages 3 to 6. And there were all of these private operators that were doing very substandard work. And so her first step was she created standards of quality that allowed her to shut down all the private operators. And so her life was threatened. People were coming to her office and saying, we're going to break your knees because she was impacting their bottom line. They had paid off the right people. They were supposed to be able to continue soaking up the money from the need of parents and grandparents for childcare. She said, no, like we're shutting you down. She said, if you break my knees, I get a vacation. You go to jail, I get a vacation. Great. Come on, bring it on. Right. So she said that was like a bigger struggle than bringing play to the people of her county. Once she shut down those private operators, there was in China is an interesting sort of political situation, right? They're a communist country, one party system. The current president, Xi Jinping, was formerly the party secretary for Zhejiang province, the province where Anji is located. And so, in his role as party secretary for the province, he visited Anji County and he said, the mountains of green and the rivers of blue are mountains of gold and silver. And what he meant was there is value in preserving the natural environment of our province or of this county. Like that has value. Like if we preserve the natural environment, people will pay to be here. And the way it often works in China is a leader will say something and then it's up to people below that leader to then implement it in terms of policy. So at the county level, like, oh, well, the party secretary for the province has come to our county. He's made this statement. We have to take this seriously. We have to do something. They started master planning. They were saying, we need to have a competitive system where each town and village and city within the county competes to be the most like beautified, naturally beautified part of our county. And if a particular village or town wins, they'll get a lot of money from the county. And so what Ms. Chung realized is that there was a standard for education in that master planning system where a certain number of points were allocated to education. It was only a couple of points, but she knew the person that was working on the standard. She said, we'll make half of the points for education for kindergarten, right? Which was, a tenth of a percentage difference in a given ranking, but that tenth of a percentage of difference could be the difference between millions of dollars of subsidies for your town and not. And so by identifying and putting that in the policy, every town and village started taking their best pieces of land and allocating them for kindergarten spaces. So she went from 4 schools to 130 schools. So there was like this policy level clarity of purpose in creating a network of accessible, universally attended kindergartens for children in China, because in China, kindergarten is not compulsory. Primary school is compulsory. Kindergarten is not. Kindergarten does not have a nationally mandated curriculum. Primary school does. Kindergarten doesn't. So she's created these schools. Given the best land, every child has space in a school. And then you get policy changes within China saying that play should be the fundamental activity of children in the kindergarten setting. And so what they did was they started making things out of bamboo. Anji County is known for bamboo production. They started making all these very rich environments with embedded learning. They were getting the kids to play. They were winning awards. They were getting recognition at the local level, at the provincial level, even the national level. Culturally responsive environments, very like the Lego model. Like, oh, we've got all these activities for learning that are station based, and we got all these lovely outcomes, right? We got all the professors saying how great this is because they get to go in there and write their papers. And what she said is she walked into the schools and she saw children smiling with their mouths, but not with their eyes. She said she saw teachers that were exhausted from creating these environments. She saw parents and grandparents that were coming in and spending their weekends and nights building these spaces, and that children weren't truly happy. What she said to herself is she said, well, if play is about joy, like if at the very least we know that play should be joyful, then what's happening in these schools is not play, right? So the national level, vague advice, children should be playing, they don't tell you how. And then this recognition that they had failed in creating environments of play, she reflected to her experiences. She said, well, I played as a child. What are my earliest, most deeply held memories, joyous memories of play as a child?
Yes.
And then she started asking other parents and grandparents and the teachers and the principals the same question. Like, what do you remember? Like, what do you remember that you can't forget about your play as a child? And they began to see that there were these very common characteristics. So I don't think they would be that distinct necessarily from your memories of play. Like
Yeah.
that simple, basic idea that if we have had experiences of play, then we can start talking about what play really is, right? And so what they realized was that play that they remembered took place generally outside, extended periods of time, oftentimes a degree of physical risk or adventure and discovery, with peers or alone, but almost never at school, rarely with adult participation or intervention. And so what she said is, well, what we have to do is we need to step back. We need to give children time and space. We need to let them have that time and space to figure things out on their own. She said to her teachers, put your hands down, shut your mouths, but open your eyes, your ears, and your heart. And so what they began to see when they took a step back was just children who had abilities that they were unaware of, that were capable of confronting and overcoming challenges that they thought were way beyond what a child could contend with or really deal with in a safe way. They saw children who were capable of resolving conflict, that were brave, that were compassionate, right? So they suddenly saw that a lot of their assumptions about children were way off the mark, right? And so as they stepped back and saw the trajectory of children in play, they realized that each time they saw play, they knew less and less about what that play actually was. That when they saw the play, they had more questions. And so then their job was to listen to children after play. Like if they wanted to understand what play was, what play meant to children, if they wanted to fulfill their professional responsibility, their obligation to support children's learning, then it was incumbent upon them to understand what children were learning, what they were capable of learning, right? And so as they listened more, their assumptions were further and further challenged. They began to see like the depth and complexity of children's experiences, the profound questions that children were grappling with. And so there's this practice in early education popularized in the West, what's called like scaffolding. It's based oftentimes on a misunderstanding of the work of Lev Vygotsky, a Russian psychologist, that talks about identifying the zone of proximal development. Here's what a child knows now. Here's what a child can know next. And here's the distance between that. And then what is trained for a lot of teachers is that you're supposed to then, in the moment, identify where the child is and then scaffold them to the next level. And what Ms. Cheng says is like, if you don't even know what a child is capable of, how are you possibly going to scaffold them? And if you're talking and if you're interfering, you're never going to see what they're capable of, right?
you're actually creating limitation for them that doesn't necessarily exist. That's so. Sorry, I've got to go back to something you said about the eyes, because I've lived with a real kind of strong ethos in a lot of the work I've done over whatever recent years, with something I picked up from Benjamin Zander, who was the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic, who wrote an incredible book with his ex-wife called The Art of Possibility. And he talks about late in his career, I think possibly in his 60s, certainly in his 50s, he had this realization as the conductor of one of the world's preeminent orchestras, I think the world's best amateur orchestra, it occurred to him one day that he was the only person in the orchestra who could make no sound, and therefore, to some extent, he was powerless beyond his ability to create something in his orchestra that meant that they weren't limited. And he said he realized one day when he looked at them that if their eyes weren't shining, there was a problem, and that his job was to say to himself, if their eyes aren't shining, what am I doing that is leading to their eyes not, being radiant, shining? And I just think it's incredible. It inverts the whole idea of leadership, really, doesn't it? To responding and opening things up, getting away from measurement. And if you haven't read it, just it's
Yeah.
a great book. And I'd recommend it to you. He talks about, whether we want to live in a world of measurement or a world of possibility. And when you were talking, that's just resonating like a clanging bell for me. We create so much limitation by imposing a requirement to measure.
Yeah. I
Fine.
think that something that's really critical here is this relationship that we have to uncertainty, that creating the safety for an experience of uncertainty is the basis of discovery, right? And so if we think about risk as just doing something with an uncertain outcome based on a prediction, right? That defies this notion of guaranteed outcomes, right? Like true deep learning happens at the edge of our ability and at the edge of our understanding. And that means that we have to have a base level of safety, right?
Yeah.
Love. So in Anji play, that first principle of love is not just I love you, it's I trust you. I'm creating a space where you are fundamentally safe. I'm listening to you. I'm holding my assumptions about you in check. When we assume things about people and then we communicate those assumptions to people, what we're saying is we're not focused on a relationship where we're seeking to truly authentically understand who you are and to see your abilities first and foremost on your own terms.
Yeah, wonderful. It struck me also when you were talking just before that, and I'm going to come on, if I may, to articulate the Angie play approach in a moment. But having read that and digested that, it is a sort of, if you like, a codification of the way to do things that was not something that Ms Cheng decided upon and then imposed. It looks to me, having watched some of the videos and read through the stuff and heard the talk and hearing you now, that that was learned by watching, that was learned through experience, and then has been codified so that the thing can spread. Is that fair? Before I go on to just, I'll articulate them, and then I'd love you to provide some detail and some flesh on the bones.
Well, I think something that's really interesting to think about is that it's practice, it's theory that's informed by practice, right? And so I think similarly, if we're saying we're creating safety for children, Ms. Chung's first step was to create the safety for her teachers to step back, to say, I'm going to protect you from the demands of parents, from the demands of experts or assessors. I'm going to say, you are safe. You have permission to simply step back and observe, right? And so I think there are basic fundamental theories or ideas. Children need to play. You're allowed to step back. If we hold our assumptions in check, we're going to learn more, right? And then systems of observation, of reflection, pedagogical systems, curricular systems emerged from observing who children actually are, what their needs are, what their abilities are. And so it's a way in which this is a theory that's deeply informed by observing children, that's informed by practice. What I'd say has been very interesting as a phenomena is that, you know, teachers, when they first started doing this, they said for the next 2 years, We're not going to have any outside professional development. Professors can't come here and teach our teachers, right? This is a delicate period where the teacher has to feel confidence, agency in their own ability to understand and support children's learning. And then after 2 years, then they can interact with those outside experts. And what happened was you had these experts coming in, giving lectures, and these teachers saying, well, you're wrong. Like, here's a video of a child doing something you say they can't do. Here's why if I did what you're saying they should do, I would be shutting down their learning. And so there's a way in which this is a very radical bottom up empowerment of the educator as expert, right? I know about children because I am with children, and children are teaching me about who they are. And I am creating environments that continue to
We had a
support
freeze.
who they
Oh,
are and
we
where
had
they
a
are,
freeze.
right? And so I think it's been, and there's been challenges there. There was a group of professors across China that united together to try to report Ms. Cheng at the national level because of the threat of empowered teachers to their business of holding complexity and being gatekeepers around knowledge.
Really.
You know,
What was your childhood like, Jesse, before we go on?
my parents had a bakery. I spent a lot of time in the bakery with adults, making coffee drinks and playing with dough, running around in the parks. My parents were always, I received a lot of love, a lot of unconditional love. They also were very trusting in me pursuing the things that were meaningful to me. So, I was very interested in antiquarian books when I was a young child, and I'd go hang out at this bookstore with this old couple that would repair old books. I was very interested in period music. They let me hang out at like a music workshop where people were building natural trumpets. I got interested in cycling, and I'd hang out in the repair part of a bike shop with other adults. So they allowed me to have meaningful relationships with people that could share knowledge with me. So I think that I had like a really charmed in some sense childhood in that I was not forced or pressured to fit into a particular mold. And I was trusted and encouraged to pursue things that were meaningful to me. I think that I had sometimes more adult friends than child friends, and maybe I wasn't as un unself-conscious in that sense. Like I did run around. I had a lot of fun. I can't remember necessarily my youngest years, but yeah, no, I had a lot of freedom and a lot of.
Beautiful. So, the Angie play approach. So, the first point you've already mentioned, love, the experience of being trusted, heard, seen, and respected. I mean, I love that because, as you said earlier, love isn't just a cuddle and a kiss on the cheek. It's trust. It's being allowed to be what you are, right?
Yeah.
Risk, or we could talk all day about that one. Risk is the basis of inquiry, learning, discovery, and the scientific method. Joy, so important, right?
Mm.
The presence of joy, you say the presence of joy is the clearest measure of quality in early childhood programs. Oh, yeah. Engagement, the sense of connection and purpose that arises from exploration and discovery of the physical and social worlds. And then reflection, the process of thinking about, interpreting, and understanding experiences and information. Yes, but yeah, to just say more about.
I mean, I think keeping it straightforward and simple, right? I've worked with schools where it's like, oh, yeah, love is great, but we've got all these other things that we're trying to do, right? And so what I say is like, can we just come back to these just really simple, basic ideas, right? And to redefine and to think about them in practice. I think there is an obsession with complexity and with measurement, as you were talking about. I think part of this has to do with larger historical trends, neoliberalism, the need or the feeling that measurement is objective. I mean, I think that, the objectivity of social science data is really questionable, right? Like we're robbing children of joy because they're going to get potentially a 2% higher score on reading tests in the fifth grade that are class and race bound anyways, right? So like, how are we choosing our statistics? What do those statistics even mean? I mean, we look at the history of science. I don't want to get into that whole thing, right? But even the hardest sciences, I want to say even the hardest sciences, physics, right, are not generally claiming a direct causal relationship. The purpose of the scientific method is to disprove alternative explanations, and that means that your explanation is more likely to be true. They're not making a causal argument. And so science discovery is about uncertainty. It's about experimentation, right? And so I think that it can feel unsafe to embrace a sense of uncertainty as the basis of learning, right? What I would say is that love is really interesting to me because there is in Anji play also an accountability around emotional boundaries. That love is not freaking out over something. It's not about being emotionally where a child is at any given moment. It's about having healthy. It's about creating safety. Love is about safety, and sometimes looks like having a clear boundary, right? But what I'd say is that I've worked with programs where we have children who are on the spectrum, have an emerging diagnosis, and because Anji Play says that a child has the agency to decide what they need to do in play, that child is allowed to sit and watch the other children play as long as they need to. When children come into the classroom and they're reflecting on their experiences, there's no pressure on that child to engage in active participation in the classroom. Because what the teachers in Anji have said is that that child that you let not talk for a year, in year two, they're saying the most profound things, right? They're saying things that go way beyond what you thought that child could do. We were working with a program in the British International School in Budapest. You had a child with an emerging autism diagnosis. That child, for the first few weeks, watching other children play, came back into the classroom, heard the other children talk about what was happening in play, and that child then had knowledge of the story the children were telling in their play, and then was able to join because they weren't relying on social cues. Because they had the time and space to engage based on their needs and abilities, then they became very actively engaged in ways that were way beyond what was expected of that child based on their diagnosis.
Mm.
And so I think that there's an aspect of love in that, of saying, like, do what you need to do at your pace and time. I'm not pushing you to be somewhere that I think you need to be. When we're working with children that are having really big feelings, it's not coming up and saying, here's what you're feeling, here's how you can feel better, here's a strategy or a technique, or do this or don't do that, or
Yeah.
here's a reward, or here's a punishment. It's like, you're having a real feeling. I can be there with you. I can be a safe presence that is just here. When a child is in a heightened emotional state, they're not listening to reason. They don't want somebody telling them how they feel. They don't want to be pushed somewhere or told that they are bad in some ways, right? They don't want to be singled out. So love is about safety that comes from having one's needs responded to. And so children have a need to be deeply engaged in play. And so providing spaces for play is an act of love, right? And I think that we have this desire that is reasonable to have every child experience everything. There was this famous physician from Harvard University who was in Anji and said to Ms Cheng, how do you make sure, she's like, I see some children taking the lead and some children following. How do you make sure that every child takes the lead? And she said, well, I'm a humble county administrator of education. I wouldn't do very well as a Harvard professor. You're a Harvard professor. You probably wouldn't do well as a humble administrator of education. Sometimes it's better for people to just do the things that are meaningful to them, right?
Oh yes, yes, yes. Not every kid has to. Sorry, I get kind of animated. The idea that every kid has to be a leader, or every kid has to be creative, or every kid. There are cultures from time immemorial that just accepted what we now describe as. I got to be careful now. What okay, I'll ask you a question instead.
Mm.
Are we pathologizing everything, Jesse?
Yes.
Is that the problem? That in the West we're pathologizing everything? We call it this, we call it that. I don't want to get into labels, but
Yeah.
do we just need to accept that there is this whole diversity of wiring, of emotion, of the way kids and adults appear in the world, and whatever systems we try and build, and education, I think, is, well, the most critical, right? Somehow has to accommodate all of that natural inclination without
Yeah.
without forcing people into avenues that they don't naturally feel comfortable in.
Well, I think part of this also has to do with politics, economics, and history, and cycles of scarcity and abundance. I think that if you look at, like, in America, you have Head Start, Early Head Start, which is federally subsidized early childhood education for families with children who are within a certain range of the poverty line, where in the 70s, they looked a lot like Anji right? It was play, it was love, it was care. And then, you know what? Blue collar workers weren't making as much money anymore. you had to get a college education to advance in life. And so there's a sense of scarcity and then a false promise of certainty that as long as we can get children learning at a young age, then they will advance economically, right? Things are no longer like there's no longer a promise of a better future for our children if they just do what is meaningful to them, if they just become a mechanic, if they just, do. And what's the irony now is that they're saying that like learning to code is worse for your job prospects than a face tattoo because AI is replacing things that were seen as guarantees of income. I know people that are welders and mechanics that make more money than PhDs. So I think that there is a way in which it's gotten way out of hand, that our response to scarcity is to take freedom away and try to guarantee outcomes. And that's a natural impulse. It's natural for a parent to want their child to be independent and self-sufficient. But what I'd say when I listen to interviews with young men who are incels, who have found that they don't feel a sense of value or prospect in life, that a lot of them describe childhoods where they weren't seen as having value, where authentic relationships of love were replaced with dopamine through technology, right? When I see parents whose biggest frustration is that their 3-year-old can't choose the next video on their iPad fast enough, and then they're also administering these chemicals, I'm seeing children that don't, where as they get older, their sense of value and what is desirable to them will be defined by people that are trying to exploit their insecurities, right? And so when you can create instead a childhood where children are seen as having value because of who they are, where they have adults that love them unconditionally, that's a game changer, and that's something that our systems have not been about. It's been about, oh, you're poor, so you need more words. So I'm going to say all these complicated words to you when you're a child, so that you can read better, so that you can be more like a wealthy person, right? And so, what does that tell that person about who they are and what their value is? And what I'd say is that something that happened during COVID is that, I think in the early childhood area, there's this hesitancy to think about teachers as childcare workers. But you know what? A 15-year-old is a child. They're in high school more than they are at home. And so a high school teacher is a childcare worker, right? COVID taught us that all teachers are providing care for our children. And so if more teachers thought about their role as being about care, about relationships, about seeing children as people, right, with value, that the educational outcomes would be better, the social outcomes would be better. When you ask adults what their most positive memory of school was, who their favorite teacher was, it's almost always a teacher that saw them as having value, that had a relationship where they saw them as a person that had value. And it's not a secret. It's not like, that's not complicated. And unfortunately, you don't need to write a 500-page book and get billions of dollars of funding through your NGO to do that. It's just like treat people as people, right?
Oh, this is so rich. I don't want to sound overly, catastrophic, but is this the reckoning? Are we at that point, Jesse? Because the way you just spoke about, the blue collar worker who's actually doing very well indeed, thanks very much, while the PhD is struggling to get what they would regard as meaningful work, and that's financially and in terms of perhaps a sense of purpose. I'll share a little aside with you. I had a lovely conversation with a guy called Matt Watkinson a month or so ago. Very, very smart guy, author, and runs a user experience design business. And Matt, we were riffing on some of the sludge that's all over LinkedIn actually about people talking about meaning and purpose. But a lot of this stuff is kind of, in my opinion, is getting dreadfully sort of misused or overemphasized. And Matt said to me, I kind of figure that a plumber who's busy doesn't come home from work every evening wondering what his purpose in the world is or what the meaning in his work is. And, hearing what you were saying, I wonder whether we're perhaps at a tipping point.
Yeah, we are.
I think back to when I went to university, I think it was 18% of kids in the UK, of which a very small percentage of that would have been from the sort of social background I came from. And so there was a definite sense that you made a conscious decision that it was right for you. And then I think over here now it's sort of over 50%. We've got massive problems with a lack of good quality blue collar workers, which leads to a debate, I guess, and a discussion about immigration and the need for it. But sorry, there's a lot in that, and I
Yeah,
haven't really asked you a question. But are we at a tipping
we
point
are.
now?
And I think that if we look at the rise of movements, authoritarian movements, if we look at these big social fissures that are emerging, so much of it has to do with people's sense of self-respect, their pride, their sense of value. The fact that for a long time, dominant culture has said that certain people have value, other people don't, right? And emotions are really, really easy things to use to change behavior. I think one of the brilliant things about Anji Play is that like the teacher's like, well, I've got a 30-second video of a child that's joyously engaged in discovering something where they're brilliant. I can use that emotional experience, that affective experience to change how you think about children, change how you think about education, to have you support my work, to see my expertise. But fear is a really, really powerful thing to use. And pride is a very, very powerful thing to use. And so if you have experts saying that you should do this to be better, and like, well, but my life, like, I'm doing something, I'm providing for my family, or I don't have opportunity, or I don't want to be somebody in a big city doing one of these things, it's very easy to use that situation of uncertainty, of having communicated to you that you do not have value by dominant culture. And then saying, well, there's all these other people you should be afraid of. They're taking the things that you want. Look, all these people love them more than they love you. They love the outsider more than they love the person that's really from this place. It's very easy to manipulate that because of that scarcity, that sense of an absence of an acknowledgement of one's value, right? And I think also, if you look at like we're just talking, we started this conversation of like experts don't always have the answers. I'm not saying that science is bad. I mean, I take medicine, like science is brilliant. If we listen to science, it's generally not saying what our popular journalism says science is saying. Like they're not making the A to B argument, right? But if we look at a lot of what's happening right now, it's about experts having lost their authority. Because, like, if I'm in there telling you should do all these things to get children to play towards a particular outcome, I'm like, well, seriously, I ran around on my farm or I ran around in the alleys of my place and I was learning more. It's like, am I going to trust the expert, right? And so, something that was very interesting that I think happened in China with the development of the standards for kindergarten is they essentially described kindergarten as the ideal family environment, a warm, loving space where children understood their responsibilities and their role, what their needs were versus the needs of the group, the individual in the group. It wasn't super specific, but it kind of described an ideal family. I think that we have to admit that young children in school, right, that those teachers are replacing mothers and fathers. They are taking on the role of parents. And so rather than shying away from that and saying, well, they need to be professional teachers that are teaching things, and then the unfortunate thing, which is like, all right, now as parents, we're trying to learn from the teachers how to teach our children like the teachers rather than being parents, right? That we're getting further, we're organizing these activities, we're trying to get them to do all these things, to learn all these things, to have an advantage. That no, what we should be saying is like, okay, like what does it look like for a school to be like an optimal family environment? What does it look like for a teacher to be kind of the highest form of motherhood? And that's something that's controversial to say, like, oh, the teacher. And when I went to China, when I went to Anji, I heard teachers say, like, we love the children like we're their mothers, right? And at first, it's like, that's so deprofessionalizing. That's makes me uncomfortable. Then I thought about it. And I thought, okay, well, what are you saying? You're saying, one, I love these children unconditionally. That it doesn't matter what their behavior was. It doesn't matter what they're going to be in the future. They have value now. They deserve safety. That insofar as the child is participating or is engaged, it is my responsibility to understand how the environment is creating that for the child, right? But then I think if you look back at like family life, I was researching what it looked like for Neanderthal children, for children, in the Middle Ages. You know what? Parents were busy. The children would go off and play. The parents didn't worry about them. They made the children part of the life of the family. A 3-year-old is helping cook and clean because they could, because the adult realized what the child's actual abilities were. And the child had a role in contributing as part of the family, right? They were part of a community. They had responsibilities. They had roles. There was a distinction between the emotions of children and adults. And there was a recognition and a use of children's abilities, right? And so in Anji Play programs, children are playing outside, but they're also getting, you have the food that comes out from the central kitchen. The children have to feed themselves. They organize that. They take their shoes on and off. They have roles and responsibilities. They're not seen as merely going through the motions. And what I'd say is that oftentimes in our relationships with children, we both overestimate and underestimate. What I mean is, we don't allow them to do the things that they can do. We don't make them a part of jobs and tasks that they're perfectly capable of. 3-year-olds can help cook. They can help clean, right? And then we overestimate. We expect them to act emotionally like an adult. Like they have a big feeling. We're like, oh, you need to calm down. Like that is a child experiencing the world. And so we both expect them to act like adults that have been through therapy. And then we also don't give them the things that allow them to contribute and feel valuable and to feel a sense of ability. And so it is it's a really messed up moment where we are. And again, I'm not advocating for a particular political viewpoint, but there is a value in traditional ideas of family.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean accepting whole hog all of the problems of traditionalism, right? And I think traditionalism is very appealing in places where we feel insecure about the future. And so I think there's a beautiful way in which Anji Play kind of can bring that together, right? Traditional experiences of childhood that have to do with freedom and ability, but also with uncertainty, not saying we know the answer to everything, not saying that everything has to be exactly this way. And I'll go into a little controversial area, which is like Ms. Chung was visiting the United States. We were in a classroom in California. They're talking about how teachers there acknowledge children's self-definition of gender. Ms. Chung said, well, there are boys and there are girls. And I said, well, no, like each child feels it differently. And she understood it immediately. She wasn't holding on to a particular dogmatic view of gender. She was open to understanding like where each child is. And so I think that that's not going to change in China. There are broader social expectations around gender, and so that's not going to change. And California is different. We're more progressive in that sense. But she was willing to acknowledge that she was not certain about the way things must be, but that safety and love are what's critical for a child, right?
And that's holding uncertainty and the willingness to be whether it's proved wrong or understand that in a different context, a different reality perhaps prevails is wise, right? That's wisdom, right? Again, so much in what you just said. I want to go back, if I may, to the point you made about acceptance, and it ties in again with that kind of love and releasing joy in kids. I hosted a call, an online meeting, if you like, on Friday, and I can't remember how, but we got on to teaching, and somebody asked me a question, which was, what teacher do I remember fondly, and why? Funnily enough, the first answer, going back to you learning Latin, was my first answer was my Latin teacher. I also learned Latin at school and studied Catullus, so we must share notes. It was Bernie Robson. He was. This is the early 1980s. Jesse. He was a rampant Marxist with a beard. I'm at an all boys Catholic school, by the way, and he was a nutter. He would throw board dusters at us and with intent to damage, but he was also one of the most inspiring teachers I've ever had. To this day, my love of Seneca is thanks to Bernie Robson. But so there was Bernie, and then I was pushed a bit, and actually the most significant teacher I ever had was Mrs. Drabble. I was 7 years old at primary school, and then the question was why, and the answer to that question was because I was hard work at school, and I was a kid who would have been regarded as nowadays as diverse or problematic or whatever, but Mrs. Drabble was totally accepting. She knew what I needed, which was a shitload more time outside the classroom than other kids, and her, looking back now, because having seen this with my youngest daughter, her techniques were things like, I'll find an excuse to get him to go and get something for me. Could you go and see Mrs. Foregard and get some exercise books for so-and-so or whatever? And there was an incident with, who's to this day my best friend, actually, Alan and I, we started school together 52 years and 1 month ago, and we're still pals. In fact, he's just moved back from California. And I smacked him in the face accidentally with a tennis racket. I think it was 1976. It was probably after Bjorn Borg had first won Wimbledon and everyone wanted to be a tennis player. And all hell let loose. There was claret everywhere. You know, it was really could have been a real problem. It almost looked like I was being not deliberate, but certainly out of control. And the way she handled it was incredible. I mean, there was so much care, so much love, so much understanding, and I've never forgotten it, and I never will forget it. And that is still there. I mean, I've done a bit of teaching recently, and it was very fulfilling, and I can see that love that teachers have got for kids all the time. But it strikes me now that when you see it, it's in spite of the system to have that at the forefront, and it's something that manifests itself because of the humanness of teachers, not because the systems that we've got. I'm sure it's similar, US and the UK, are are fertile for that. It strikes me that we've built systems that make that more difficult, not easier. Is that your experience in the
That is
States?
my experience. Um, there's been a movement recently called red hatting, which is like removing boys from school until after kindergarten, because of the belief that like young boys move around more, and if they're forced to sit and repeat knowledge in traditional school settings, that they'll have a low sense of their own value and they'll also get in more trouble, right? So I think that is a invitation to think about how we're thinking about and designing our systems. I think what you're describing is just sort of, again, love. Like it sounded like you received love, like love of not making assumptions about what you did. Or saying, oh, he's the bad kid. He hits kids with rackets. That's bad. I'm going to freak out. Oh, you did it again. Carlo, you did it again. You need to go over there. No more rackets for you, right? Which is a really negative message to send to somebody about their potential or their value. One of the things that I've seen, and has been a big part of our work and working with, because most of my work is around like professional development with teachers outside of China.
Right.
I'm lucky when I get to be with Ms Cheng and interpreting for her, but a lot of the work I do is around teaching teachers or working with teachers. Is that you see for particularly for young boys, but also in particular for young brown and black boys, that they start getting in trouble in kindergarten and in preschool, right? That they start moving in big ways, right? Teacher wants circle time. They want the children to sit and sing a song for 20 minutes or 30 minutes. The child starts moving around. Then it's like all of these strategies to regulate the child's feelings. And then they're being labeled and they're starting to perceive themselves as not having value and as being different from the group. The children start reflecting the attitude of the teacher, right? But if instead we say that moving around is valuable, right? That not only is it acceptable or a need, but that, hey, like as a teacher, I'm seeing that child move in big ways where they're learning something that we can all learn from, that's worthy of our interest and respect. So not only is it not something that's not disruptive, but it's something that has a positive value, that changing how a child sees themselves, like seeing their own needs as both being valuable, but also as being something that other people can share in and be a part of and can inform the teacher or inform environments or materials, also begins to change children's attitudes just to the very act of learning or being in school. I mean, similarly around language, within the Anji Play approach, children play, teachers take videos of children engaged in play, children come in after play and draw a picture of their play. The teacher writes down the child's description of their drawing every day. The children every day watch videos and then lead their own discussion of that play. The teacher's not leading them to particular insights or outcomes. That you see children being encouraged to talk about and describe their experiences in their own language. It's not saying change your language to fit our models. It's saying how you describe and think about what you're doing has value. So a lot of early childhood models are about trying to correct what are perceived as cultural or economic faults or deficits in the child's language so that they're more conforming to a particular standard that is seen as the right way, right? But if we say instead, I'm interested in understanding what your experience means to you. I'm going to put in the effort and I'm going to value and celebrate how you were telling your story. You see children that develop the ability to describe their experience, that take interest in and see value in describing what's meaningful to them. And so the school says what you're doing and thinking has value and what you say about it is incredibly interesting to me, and it informs how I understand you and how I understand children generally, informs my teaching, then that changes the child's attitude to what learning is about, right? So you describe these systems where it is not keyed to where children really are. And in fact, what it often does is says, where you are is bad, where I am is good. And after a while, children are like, fuck, like, F you. Like, I don't care, right? Children are incredibly adept at seeing hypocrisy and saying to adults, F this noise. I don't want to be a part of this, right? Like, I don't like what you have to offer. That's not valuable to me. It starts at a young age. And what's amazing is it can be changed, right? Positive relationships with an adult who does see you. Like, children are also incredibly plastic, right? I heard an interview with a girl whose father shacked up and with this woman. They became serial killers, and she was suicidal, and she was in school and she was very young, and she had a teacher that said to her, like, you have beautiful handwriting. And that changed everything for her. So you think about somebody going through so much trauma, it just takes one person, right? Like, children are, it's like children are incredibly intelligent, but they just want some love. And I think that what children also know is that, like, that their ability to understand what's going to happen next from adults, to control situations through their emotions, is a survival instinct, right? And so children are also very adept at getting adults to emotional places where adults are kind of out of control. I think that our how we model our relationships with children becomes how children treat themselves and treat each other. I'm going to give you one quick example, and I know I'm talking a lot, but we
No,
were,
no,
we
please.
were working with a program. There was a child who, when children were playing, would start like throwing objects, hurting kids, swearing. We're talking about like a 4.5-year-old. Um, because we were working with the school and they were taking videos of play, and then we were coming together every 2 weeks to reflect on those videos. Fortunately, we had videos of what was happening right before that child began to have those outbursts, right? And what we saw is the child was seeking a relationship with the teacher, right? And so we said to the teachers, okay, instead of being frustrated that that child wants your attention, is taking you away from appreciating the other children's play, guess what? All the children are independently engaged. You can actually pay attention to that child. So before he starts being disruptive and you have to respond in a way that's about his negative behavior, he's indicating to you that he needs a relationship. Go and be with that child. And so the teachers started doing that. And it was not easy and it took time. But we looked at a video of play at the end of the year, and you had that child with their friends, right? And the children's friends were giving him time and space. They were patient with him. They saw that he was tired. He had a lot going on at home, like stuff that is just beyond what we can think of as trauma, right? And they
Yeah,
acknowledged his value, his humanity. They gave him a place in the play where he sat, where even though he was tired, he was able to be engaged, where they had a lot of respect for him. They were seeing, children look to the adults to see what to do. And so if an adult shows love and listening and patience, children will show each other love and listening and patience. And oftentimes, if adults aren't around, children will do that already, right? Like, oftentimes the default of children is actually to be kind to each other.
yeah,
There's a
yeah.
lot that we can learn from children. They can,
And they learn those more what we would regard as more adult behaviors through play, don't they? You know, kids playing mummies and daddies or nurses and doctors or whatever it might be. Those kind of they enjoy, they love playing what they perceive to be adult games. In my experience with 4 kids, I think precisely because it allows them to step into those unbounded roles that they're somehow aspiring to learn to be, which if there's too much structure, they don't find through that explorative process.
yeah.
That feels so obvious to me, but so look, there's so much here, Jesse. But do you think, to what extent is, I'm going to stray into some dangerous territory, but fuck it. Is the fact that there is a background, if you like, of a lower level of discipline in, I can only speak from a UK perspective, and there clearly is. I'll give you an example. I've got a good friend who's a deputy head of a state primary school in the UK. Can't remember a day when she hasn't been told to fuck off by a kid between the age of 4 and 11. Can't remember. It's in London, but it's not in a dreadfully deprived area. It's in an average part of London. can't remember a day when there hasn't been physical violence between kids in the school, and can't remember a week when there hasn't been physical violence towards a teacher. Now, I mean, that's astonishing to me that we've allowed a situation to get to that point. And I'm drawn back to China for a moment. Would I be wrong to assume that Anji play and part of its success has been because there is an underlying much higher level of discipline or an acknowledgement of what is and isn't acceptable
I think
things?
yes, and so I think within China there is a very strong culture of respect for teachers, of respect for adults. There's a lot more sort of cultural homogeneity. Um,
Yeah,
that being said, within Anji, you have a migrant labor population. Every person and child is different, of course, but I think there is that. I think there is that has allowed that to develop perhaps more seamlessly. I mean, I think there are other challenges. You have children entering kindergartens in China that have never really interacted with other children, where everything's been spoon fed to them, where they haven't been given any freedom, or they've been
right,
treated like they're the only ones in the world, right? But what I'd say is that a lot of my work has been working with schools that are much more like what your friend described, right, in their program.
right, okay,
And I think that is the test. And I think to me, what we think about is what I call like 100% spaces. Like you'll have an early child program is, well, it's very nice, right? But there's always going to be that 10% of kids that just don't fit in, right? Their behavior is too big, they have too many problems, they get the outside help, and then they're slowly pushed out, right? Like there's always like there's always that group or child or group of children that just don't quite fit in. I mean, Montessori I would describe as maybe 75% spaces, whatever, right? Where it's like the structure is very specific, you're supposed to act a particular way. Certain children just don't have buy into it or whatever. You know what? When a child is saying fuck you, when a 4 year old is saying fuck you, they want to see how you're going to respond. Are you going to freak out? If you freak out, they're in charge now, right? Like if I'm freaking out because a child says something to me, they're in charge of my emotions. They're calling the shots, right?
yeah,
And so it's unsafe to have that much power as a child. And so what you're saying to that child is they're on their own. Like you are on your own in terms of your safety because I don't have the self regulation to respond to that in a way that's A, not freaking out, or
right,
B, not about punishing you, right? Like if I'm saying like a 5 year old can't be punished because a 5 year old is a 5 year old, if they say fuck you, they're trying to get me to act a particular way. Hey, guess what I am?
yeah,
Guess what? They are smarter than me. Like, you know what? Honestly, a child that says something and gets you to respond a particular way that they have predicted is smarter than you because
yes.
and you've lost your control. They're in control in that situation, right?
So we have to put a stop to that sort of thing being acceptable.
Yeah, and so I think the question is sort of like why is a child going to want to be in a school, right? If I say to a child, if I say to a 6 year old, you should want to be in this school so that you'll advance in life, so that I'm going to give you some little prize at the end of the day, so that you get the respect of all these adults that treat you like shit, right? So that 20 years from now you can have a mortgage, right? That's be like fuck you, right? As a child, I would say fuck you, right? Um,
Yeah,
but if you say to a child, here's a space where you have all these things that you can engage with, where you can just sit there if you don't want to, where you can wrestle with your other friend, right? That you're going to eliminate a lot of the noise. So a big part of Anji play, what I've seen in working with schools that are not all well-behaved children from Chinese families in a homogenous, village, right? Where it's diverse for any number of reasons. That if you create spaces where children have time and space to play, we have a present, responsive, loving adult where the child's voice is important, that like a lot of the behavior that the teachers are usually doing disappears, right? Like a lot of those big behaviors disappear. And then you can focus on that one or two
right.
children that has the really big things that really need that strong, direct, supportive relationship. Like I'm not dealing with every boy who's pissed because they can't play because they're all playing, and I'm dealing with the one boy whose family is homeless or who is having that problem at home where I can be there for them. Or I can be that teacher that has
Yeah.
that relationship.
I mean, that's what I was really itching to ask you because I know, obviously, as the CEO of Anji Education, that you're not spending all your time in China or only interpreting and working with Ms Cheng. So you are seeing the success of this model, this approach, these principles
Yeah.
in, frankly, a completely different cultural, sociological setting, and it
Yeah.
works, right? Now,
Absolutely.
you said earlier on, a lot of what we've discussed looks like, or I said, it looks like a lot of what my experience was at primary school in the early 1970s. And that's reassuring. I mean, I could ask you an obvious question, which is like, right, so why aren't we doing more? Why aren't we bringing it more into the West and so on? Perhaps we'll come on to that. But let's go back to the five principles, if we may.
Yeah.
So the second one, risk. I mean, this is so easy for me to say because it was my childhood. I've described it as feral. I mean that in the best possible way. You know, I lived in trees when I wasn't at school, pretty much, or on the roofs of garages, or we. That was the environment. It was incredible. We had a lot of freedom, and we burned a lot of energy, and we made a lot of mistakes, and we engaged in a shitload of risk. And I can't imagine what I would be now, if I'm honest, had I not almost lanced all of those exploratory boils
Yeah.
at that age. I've got a pretty good idea, actually, and so have you.
Yeah.
I can tell by the look in your face. And it would probably not be me sitting here with a load of books behind me doing a podcast with you from California.
Yeah.
So that kind of dance with risk and that throwing oneself into what frankly often were unsafe situations under the sort of standards that we would apply today was very, very important to me. What can we do and what should we do to reframe what we regard as acceptable risks for kids these days?
You know, it's so interesting. Maybe 6 years ago, there was this big emerging discourse about the positive value of risk in children's play. And I heard a lot of like advocates and parents like kind of valorizing or romanticizing, like, oh, I'm like the cool negligent parent, or like, oh, like whatever, danger play. And I said, you know what? I'm reframing this as safety. That risk is about creating the safety for a child to be independently engaged in the world, right? That
Yeah,
that risk without safety is hazard, right? And so children don't want to get hurt. As a child, you were doing things that were potentially dangerous, but your desire was not to get hurt. And getting hurt generally put an end to whatever you were doing at that moment. And you probably learned
yeah,
something from it. It's not saying that like bumps and bruises and scrapes aren't an important part of learning, because they absolutely are. But what we think about when we think about, because we're talking about risk as a aspect of an approach to education where adults are creating spaces where they are responsible for the child, that we differentiate between risk and hazard, right? So in Anji play settings, children have huge, big ladders and planks and barrels, and they're climbing trees and they're jumping, and it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. But there is a lot of intentionality into how those ladders are designed. They are not going to break, right? There are not things, aspects, elements in the environment that are beyond the capacity of the child to perceive or control, right? So my child likes to climb. I can't keep them from climbing the bookcase all the time. So I'm going to anchor the bookcase to the wall, right? Like an unanchored bookcase and a child left alone is a hazard. An anchored bookcase and a child left alone is risk, right? And so fortunately,
okay,
as adults, we can be intentional around that so
yeah,
that we can actually see what children are capable of in terms of risk assessment, right? And so I think that we can also think about risk as not just being physical risk, like raising your hand in class, reaching out a hand, like connecting two concepts across disciplines is a form of risk, right? But if we're just talking about the physical risk, which is really important, then I think it's like, okay, as adults, we can minimize the potential for hazard while allowing for the greatest degree of risk.
right. That's a beautiful construction. I don't want to sound, and I probably am, like I'm glamorizing everything that happened in the early 1970s. There was elements, and you just raised a point which made me think about risk. The element of risk that was absolutely not a part of my childhood was the risk to be able to comfortably express emotions that might have been regarded as not very, boy-like. So, and I am conscious that I'll be honest with you, Jesse. I want to tell you this because the reason at the moment I'm so interested in childhood and play, it's not just because I'm the father of 4 kids, it's because I have spent a lot of time over the last 18 months revisiting my childhood on an emotional level. And it ties in with, I mentioned earlier, I've never really spoken about this, but my youngest daughter, who's 12, 18 months ago, we were advised by her school to have her assessed. And turns out, through quite an intensive process, that she has ADHD.
As do I, and I assume my 10-year-old daughter probably does too.
And here's the interesting thing, if I may, because I feel comfortable discussing this with you. In the process of having 3 different conversations with very well-regarded child psychologists, I was fucking furious about the questions that were being asked, about the questions I was being asked, about the assertions that were being made. And my wife, who's very much calmer than I, on each occasion said to me afterwards, this is not about you, calm down. By the end of that process, I suddenly had this incredible realization that I had just been really exposed to what I had lived through 40 something years ago, 50 years ago perhaps. And I made a decision then, really driven by my relentless and insatiable curiosity, that I'd quite like to find out for me. So I invested in doing that, which in the UK you have to invest in because otherwise it takes years and years and years. And here's what got interesting. So my first discussion with a psychiatrist was, I gave her, I think, probably a sort of a 15-minute monologue on why it couldn't possibly apply to me. I'm never late. I did well at school academically. Yes, I was troublesome, but I didn't nearly go to prison. I'm not, and so on and so forth. She was fantastic. She said, let me take you back to your childhood. Outside a lot? I said, well, the question really is, was I ever inside? And she said, what was discipline like at school? And I said, oh, yeah, it was pretty fierce. Yes, I had to go and stand outside Miss Taylor's office. She was the head teacher. Quite a bit, but, right, okay. Then we talked a little bit about my family. I had a fantastic childhood. My dad was at work most of the time, but, it was strict. Then she talked about lateness, and I have such a paranoia about being late. The joke is I'll often end up at meetings a day early. So if I've got a meeting at 8 or 9 a.m. a long way away, I'll go the night before. And what she then really described was all of these compensations or whatever, coping mechanism, if you want to call it that one makes. And anyway, the process goes on. I get my little ticket and, I can join the club, as it were, which is fascinating. But what that was, you'll have heard this before, what that was for me was just incredibly liberating in some respects, because it suddenly made sense of everything that didn't make sense to that point. And so I've been going back and excavating more and more and more and writing about and so on my childhood, because I'm seeing everything that I question, and we do, don't we, as I've got older and older and older, through that lens, not through the lens of neurodiversity or ADHD or whatever, because that frankly doesn't really interest me. I've always known my wiring was a bit fucked, and that has advantages and disadvantages. But actually the thing that I'm finding, sorry, I'm ranting a bit, but the thing that I'm finding more and more interesting is the extent to which the way your childhood is handled, or the framing within which it happens, is so important. I mean, I'll give you an example, if I may. My mother's still alive. She's 87. My dad was 11 years older than my mum, died 17, 18 years ago. Can you access your school reports? Now, my mum is housebound and in a wheelchair, so there's no prospect. She's very particular about things, so there's no prospect to me rummaging through everything. I know they still exist. So the question then was, well, have a conversation with her anyway. Here's a checklist, and it's a pretty meaty checklist. As you know, it's very serious process as an adult over here because of all the, whatever, all the things you can do with it to your advantage in the workplace. Doesn't apply to me because I work for myself. But and the first question on the list, I asked my mum. I said, "Was I naughty?" Blah 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 blah. And she said, very sweet. She said, "Oh, I don't think so." And I said, "Well, I was, mum, wasn't I?" And she's like, "Well, I mean, not really any more than any other kids, were you? Were you?" And she's asking me, and I'm like, "Mum, I was in front of Miss Taylor's office once a week. I was this, I was that, I was the other. Don't you remember, having to rattle the little jar with the wooden spoons in as the warning that, there was a smack on the arse coming or whatever. God, I'm going to have to edit this out." And my point is that as we went through these questions, it took about an hour. What my mum was seeing was just me, right?
Yeah.
Being very boisterous, more so than my brother, needing to be handled differently to my sister. It wasn't always a bed of roses, far from it. But it was just you being you, were her words. And the same with my gran. I vividly remember we spent every summer with my gran. I was a nightmare at times, but there was all of that, what you've described as love, which is what it is. There was all of that kind of acceptance, not allowing me to dictate terms, but there were times when there was drama, of course. And I keep coming back to what you said earlier, something about language. It reminded me, was it Wittgenstein said, the limits of our language, or the limits of my language, are the limits of my world. And what I was given, the greatest gift I was given, was that sort of acceptance in the closest environment, i.e. family, to allow me not to fail and fuck up and end up in prison or whatever, which sounds kind of dramatic, but I think there's something in all of us. I really do. I just wanted to share that with you. But what can we do to make sure that we don't kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater with all this pathologizing of everything and everyone getting a label and everyone wanting to be, or not wanting to be, but everybody being described as either traumatized or neurodiverse or a little bit on the spectrum? Or
I think that the stories we tell about ourselves to ourselves are very important in how we experience the world. And I think that our stories of ourselves are informed by the stories others tell about us. And I think those are done in intentional, unintentional, and subtle ways. I think a school environment tells us a story about ourselves, right? If I go into a school and the school says playing and running around and being boisterous and then talking the way you talk is valuable, that school is telling a story about me that's positive, right? If my mom says, "Oh, you know what, you're just a kid, I love you, you're, oh, Carlo, he's just being Carlo," right? That is a story of acceptance, right? That is a story that we internalize, that we're not so bad, we're not so different, that, oh, you know what, things are maybe more challenging for me in terms of planning or organizing around this, but you know what, like, I'm good at things, right? That I think that we can both support each person's difference through understanding how we're different, but I think so much comes down to telling stories about people that are positive and supportive and accepting, right? And so I think we think about ADHD, for instance. ADHD is a problem insofar as it prevents you from complying with a system that isn't designed around your particular way of being, right? And so I think pathologies um, flatten human experience. Um, I think can be, I don't know. I mean, this comes down to questions of objectivity, right? And I'm not here to question science or question the value of diagnosis or question the value of medication, but I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 41. I'm 43, right? Right, and I made an appointment, and the psychiatrist from the network is like, "Why do you have ADHD? Why do you think you have it?" About a minute and a half in, he's like, "You don't have to say anything more. Like, I know, like, it's clear, right? Like, it wasn't that complicated." And so I wonder, it's like, oh, if I had been medicated as an 8-year-old, right? If I had access to all these things, all right, maybe I'd be a chartered accountant instead of like figuring out education, right? Would that have been better? I don't know, right? So I think the question is like, I was lucky to have adults that supported and understood and accepted me. And so maybe that was enough therapy for me at that age. Maybe I would have, maybe I would be excelling even more at what I'm doing right now if teachers hadn't always said, oh, he's got so much potential, but he could do so much better, right? Rather than saying, oh, yeah, this child is different, right? And so those stories about myself, about my own lack of ability, however that's defined what I've done in life, that is life, that is existence. But I think that adults, as people thinking about the children in our lives, or as thinking about systems of education for children, or even for young adults or adults, it's like, what story are we telling about somebody else, right? And if it's a story of ability, of potential, of acceptance, I think we're taking a step towards pathologization being less necessary in marshaling the support that somebody might need to thrive, right? And so, like, thinking about that more traditional view, like your mother's view, it might be like, oh, like little Carlo or little Jesse, he's lovely, he's different. Oh, it's really great that he wants to be a mechanic. He doesn't need to go to college and be something that is put up as like the ideal for development, right? Because so much of our pathologization is about a child's inability to obtain the outcomes that we define as success, right?
Yeah, do you know what's interesting, Jesse? Is, oh Christ, this makes me feel really sad to say. Having had the beauty of that childhood just filled with awe and wonder and experimentation and acceptance, it was the adult world that imposed on me all of the things that then caused a great deal of confusion and a sense of not quite belonging and fitting in.
Yeah.
And I've never really thought about that until this conversation.
But now
I wonder what that is. I don't know where to go with that. But
I
do you
think
have any sort of reaction or any thoughts?
I think
Does it resonate with
it
you at
does. Well,
all?
I think a lot about, because I have children. I have a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old. I think a lot about education. I look at what's happening around us. I think about, okay, so if I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that like having a white collar job or getting an advanced degree is not the objective measure of success or what I want for any particular person in life, what is it, right? Like how are we defining what is valuable for a child as they become an adult? And I think it is, independence, meaning, hopefully, I mean, I guess however we describe thriving. But again, I feel like a lot of that, the capacity to provide for oneself, to encounter the world, comes down to understanding our own value, knowing how what is valuable and meaningful to us fits in with a larger group. And so I think the thing that scares me the most is that children are being raised to not be a problem by plugging into content that's designed to manipulate people's brains to make a profit, which then transitions into spaces where value is defined by obtaining particular socially defined outcomes like cars or jewelry or power or women, right? And when that becomes unobtainable, then life becomes miserable. The life of an adult becomes miserable. Either it's the miserable chase of the things that will allow you to do that, or it's the understanding that you will never obtain those things that your brain has been conditioned to think are the only measures of one's value. And so, what is most important to me about this work is creating spaces and systems where a child's value, a person's value, has to do with the things that are meaningful to them and that they are capable and motivated to be doing, right? And I think that the more one has that in their lives, the more one has a childhood where they get to play, where even if an adult is not saying they have value, other children are part of that experience of value, of contribution, of meaning making, right? Outside of passive reception or manipulation towards particular behaviors, right? And it's so much. I see so many children who are being pacified or controlled by adults that don't want to deal with an authentic relationship with a complicated human being. The child is a complicated human being. They need love. Love is takes effort. It takes health in ourselves. And I don't want to I don't want to just blame adults. Like, it's hard for us as adults, right? Like, we are in these things, we are in these feedback loops. And so I don't know what the answer is. But I know that the need is love and a sense of one's own value as a child. I think that is more likely to create an adulthood that isn't as scary as it might seem.
Can I share something personal with you?
Please.
I've been thinking a lot recently, for various reasons, about success, what it is, what it means, what it is for me. Does it matter? Is it relevant? And a couple of days ago, because I'm so nostalgic. I was thinking about what success looked like through this frame that I don't seem to be able to shake off of childhood and nostalgia, and I don't see nostalgia, by the way, as a negative thing. Far from it. I'm going to share something with you that I wrote down for this conversation. That's about that very thing. But the point is, I decided, and I'd love your view on this, that the real test or measure of success for me is that I don't disappoint the child that I was. And if I could carry that forward, I think it reframes everything, because that child, you know, I had dreams before there was compromise. I had, no one was telling me what was realistic or practical or possible. What were the things that made my eyes light up? And a lot of that was in school, by the way. I loved school. What was justice? I think kids are brilliant at working out what's
Yeah,
just
they really are.
on their own. And so the more I think about all of that, Jesse, the more I'm coming to the conclusion that, I mean, it's not quite as simple as that, obviously, in the adult world, but it seems like a nice framing. And that's one of the reasons I was so keen to have this conversation with you, as somebody who is, in all the right ways, an expert in this field.
I think the children that we were is also the children that we have. So I think part of success is also living a life where our children can see something that doesn't disappoint them, or that inspires them, or that's meaningful to them. So I think I'm acutely aware of how the way I live my life informs my children's experiences, how they see themselves, what they see as a model, and I try to hold myself accountable to that. I try to give myself grace, but I think that's also, for me, I think maybe I have a very minimal definition of a success, which is just like making sure my kids are safe,
Yeah,
and
it's hard.
everything else is gravy.
Parenting is brutally hard, isn't it? Yeah, the thing I've got written down. I'm conscious of your time, and I don't want to take liberties with it, but I'll read it to you if I may.
Yeah.
I say here, I think I've had a preoccupation with nostalgia all my life. I'm pretty certain it stems from my father's inability to talk at all about his childhood or anything of his life in Naples before he came to the UK in 1958. So, as I wonder about how creative nostalgia is, I'm drawn to a lovely thing that Joan Didion said, which is, we forget all too soon the things we thought we could never forget. It comes from her essay on keeping a notebook and ties in with the piece I wrote yesterday about Leonardo da Vinci and his Zibaldones, which are his notebooks. I think whenever rapid change causes us to question our sense of belonging, meaning, and connection with the world, we turn to our childhood, whether that's consciously or unconsciously. For me, looking back to my childhood and reflecting on my father's and my mother's, is about refinding the value, the inner core of what we were brought up to believe in, rather than just excavating memories. And it's certainly not about sentimentality. Joan Didion went on to say, we forget the loves and betrayals alike, forget what we whispered and what we screamed, forget who we were. Well, I'm not sure we should do. I really think there is so much, assuming obviously, one's childhood is not badly damaged, but on that basis, I just think we should stay more connected to it. And I think seems to me to be the norm into adulthood. Am I onto something?
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, I think that reflection and recording. I mean, thinking about Anji play, children are drawing a picture of their play every day, and the teacher every day is writing down the child's description. Teachers are taking videos and videos and videos of play, and children are watching those videos every day and describing it, right? They're engaged in this thinking about thinking, this metacognitive like level of reflection, that in some sense it's about children understanding their experience in the moment. It's about the adult or the educator learning more about the child's experience. But I think it's also about keeping present in one's mind the meaning of the past and like the value of that experience. So you're never losing sight of kind of the both the value and the content of that moment. But what's really fascinating to me about adults and children looking at videos, and a lot of the work I do is reflecting on videos of play with adults. I have a very simple protocol we use, is that each time we watch the video, we see something different. We change our assumptions. We question our assumptions. That whether it's the immediate past or the distant past, again, coming back to Wittgenstein and words, it's like reality is just how we describe what we have experienced, and each of us describes it differently, and we describe it differently every moment of our experience. And so there is no objective past. There is whatever feelings we have, whatever impressions we have. And then I think it is interesting to think about, how are we recording that? What are we grasping and setting down and coming back to? And I think it is incredibly valuable. I think it is a way to be within uncertainty, to have the safety, to not be unmoored, right? To
Yeah.
know the impact of our agency in the world. And I've watched videos where it's like Rashomon, right? Where it's like I've watched a video and I have this impression of this child as being somehow having some negative intention, and then I realize it's because the direction of the sun is casting a shadow over his eyes, right? And so my feeling about what was happening there was being impacted by something where, like Magritte said, it's not a pipe, right? Like the treachery of images, and I think the treachery of memory, but I think also the value of memory. I know that's not helpful.
Yes.
That's
No, it is. It is because memories are. Yeah, I mean that's a whole nother. That's hopefully part two of this because memory is a wonderfully fertile but also unreliable thing, isn't it?
yeah.
I'm bound to ask you, Jesse. Can we do this? Can we do this? Can we bring the Anji play philosophy and infuse it throughout all of the education systems that we're operating in, and do it quickly? We just need to, don't we?
I think people are
And
beginning.
that's not a criticism of, sorry, that's not a criticism of
Yeah.
teachers. It's not a criticism of people's work ethic or anything else. It just strikes me that we have to do things differently.
I think there is an increasing recognition that that is what is necessary. More and more people are saying that the problems we've identified are problems. I think that Anji Play provides a very, very valuable set of systems and experiences, that, in many elegant ways, are applicable across time and space and culture. Right now, I am about to start raising money to open a school in the United States. So, what I know is you have to create a model that people can see locally, that people can learn from. So I've done a lot of work of pre-existing programs in schools. It's been successful. We've done a lot of great things. There are ways in which we can find that agency within systems to increase relationships of love, to bring in more play. But I really need to build this from the ground up so that we can respond to those systems. So the next step, the next year, the next 2 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years is building that model here so that everywhere in America can know that we can do this here. Um, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'll post some notes to where people can find you to the RG Play website. But is there anything that anybody can look at to get real sort of specific insight, that you'd recommend, or connect with you directly
Yeah,
to
connect
kind
with
of.
me directly. We have a series of specific, like, educator directed, pre-recorded professional development that people can access through the website. So you can learn more about the specific practices, But yeah, just reach out to me. Like I'm very responsive. I'm really eager to connect with and to work with people to whom this speaks. Right.
Fantastic. Can I ask you another, which may be, slightly, it's not a loaded question, but maybe slightly awkward, which is that do you perceive the connection with this being a philosophy which has developed and blossomed in China, in some respects being problematic for you in it getting traction in the States and largely, I guess, to the same extent, the UK?
I haven't actually. Yeah, I'll tell. There was. We were working with a program in the Sierra foothills, a rural part of California, a subsidized program where they had ordered material. Like we were working with a professional loan, they ordered materials from China. The mats, these really beautiful mats that children jump on, showed up, and they were covered in camouflage, like military camouflage. And the director, like the managers, were like, "This is a problem, right? Like we can't bring militarism into school. This is going to be a huge problem." And guess what? All the parents that were hunters and welders, they were excited. They loved it, right? Like this is amazing, right? And so I think that sometimes what we at a higher level can see as a political issue actually belies a deeper sense of connection to authenticity at the level
Right,
of the parent or the
right.
community. I think it might be something that's challenging for a big investor who might say like, "Oh,
Because of the
China."
geopolitical environment.
Yeah, but I don't really see it from the philosophy. I mean, I think the scary thing is that I think now Silicon Valley wants more people like working 20 hours a day and like marching in lockstep in their vision of China. I think the
Yeah.
irony is like we need to go to China to bring love and freedom to America. That's where we are.
I want to share with the listeners the beautiful moment that we had after the talk when we met, and I was just really keen to see you and to thank you and Ms Cheng, who she and I had a very awkward 10 minutes earlier on prior to the lecture barn where she needed something and we just couldn't understand each other, and then you appeared, thank God. But it was after the talk, and someone else came up and asked you to translate to her. I don't know if you remember this. Could you say to Ms Cheng, if there's anything we can do to help, to let us know? And I said to you, I think the question's the other way
Yeah,
around. I think we should be saying, please, can you help us?
yeah,
Because we need it. And I meant that sincerely from the bottom of my heart. She really moved me. You both really moved me in in an uplifting way to see, if you like, the recognition of what I feel we have lost to some extent, and I'll get criticised for that, from a what we would regard as a completely different culture in 2025 was like, come on, we can see this. It's right there in front of our eyes. We've known it. We've never lost that knowledge, have we,
no,
Jesse?
no, it's there.
We've just chosen not to, I guess, lead with it. Comes back to love. You've spoken so much all the way through this conversation about how love is the not just the catalyst, is the red thread that enables this whole fixing of some of the problems we've got to withhold all the pressures that they're going to be subject to, right?
Yeah, and keeping it simple. I mean, I think there's an aspect of love that's about simplicity, right? It's not, I've been working on this pitch deck, and like part of it is like, you already know this. Like, I'm going to describe the best possible form of education, but guess what? Deep down inside, you already know what this is. It's not that complicated.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
it's simple but profound. Um, so yeah,
There was something beautiful I picked up. I'd like to leave with this, if you don't mind.
mm,
So I'm a bit of a geek, a bit of a weirdo, and I know you studied at Columbia. And Columbia's Latin motto is "In lumine
with David,
tuo
well,
videbimus lumen,"
yeah,
right? Is that right?
yeah, in your
In thy light we shall see
life,
light.
yeah.
That's what you're doing. You're living out that motto in your professional career. I think there's just a beautiful resonance about that.
And in Chinese, the word for culture is the illumination of text, Wenming, bringing light to words.
Wonderful. Jesse, I'm so grateful to you for your time. I guess it would only be right for you to see us off in Mandarin, frankly.
好了，非常感谢你。我也很荣幸有这个机会和你一起交流和分享我们的经验和我们的知识，为了我们共同我们大家的未来，非常感谢。Much.
Beautiful. And that means,
That means thank you so much. It's really a great honor to have this opportunity to share and to learn from each other and to share each other's wisdom and knowledge for our collective future.
well, I'm so grateful, and thank you. I shared with you some stuff that maybe may have been a little bit difficult, and I'm grateful to you for making me feel comfortable to do that. And hopefully we can hopefully we can do this again. I feel like we've only just scratched a bit of an itch actually
Yeah,
about what's next.
yeah, we can plan. We should start planning on building that school physically and theoretically. I mean, that's an interesting question.
Wonderful. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
and enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Take care. Thanks again.